Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another look at Musescore 4. We've been looking at, in some longer discussions, the pitfalls and the benefits to Musescore 4, and my thoughts on the state of the software, and some kind of hacky ways to deal with the problems that the software presents, at least if you are able to use it on your system. Some people aren't able to use it quite yet, and many bugs are being worked out. But if you are able to use it, and you're able to use the Muse sounds, and you want to get increased realism, we've been talking about concepts to do that. And I want to do a direct head-to-head comparison to make my point here about achieving realism from a notation play engine. And as we load this up, I'm going to show you an original file. So this is the original for brass. We're going to focus on brass because this seems to be taking the most flack from people. So we see here we have a brass ensemble. First off, because I know somebody will make an issue out of it, the order for brass instruments in a brass ensemble is not the same as an orchestra lineup. So orchestral lineup for brass has horns above trumpets and so on. The wind ensemble, brass ensemble, wind ensemble, particularly the Western American version of this, is highest to lowest instrument. So trumpets on top, then horns, then trombones, baritones, euphoniums if you have them, and then tuba. The fact of the matter is that it doesn't really matter as long as there's a logic to it, and there is a precedent for this in the wind ensemble idiom, which is what you would use typically for a brass ensemble that doesn't include strings or woodwinds. Also, you know, this is in C. I just have it scored in C for right now. I believe it is, yeah. So you'll notice that there's no key signatures here for transpositions. I just have every part scored in C just for ease of writing and understanding harmonic analysis here as you're looking at it. So what I want to do is I want to play this whole thing in real time, no post-processing, mastering or anything, just so you can hear what everything sounds like. And then we will play a playback file so you can hear what the potential is when you noodle around with the notation. And I'm going to discuss how you should noodle around with the notation, particularly for brass instruments, to generate a much bigger realism to it. So let's listen here from the very beginning. I've already shared this once before. This is a brass ensemble piece I composed about a year ago, just as a suite of symphonic works. And I've imported this now into Musescore 4, and I'm using it sort of as a demonstration. So listen carefully as we play this back. In fact, why don't I decrease the size a little bit so you can see a little bit more of the score. So put it on 50%, and high definition, you ought to be able to see everything there. Okay, so a couple of things here to note. It doesn't know how to deal with forte piano very well. You can hear some of the samples that it chooses going up to this high concert C. And the trumpet, it plays kind of what a brass player would call a fracky sort of note. There's a bit of a splia on the beginning of the note. Now, that's not the only sample that there is, as you're going to see later on. You can actually, that note doesn't always sound that way. You can put an articulation on this or change some quality of the note dynamically, and you'll get a different velocity or a different articulation that sounds a lot cleaner. So the interpretation there and the sample that they're using, it misses the mark. It misses. It's very college band, sounding, that kind of fracky note there. So that's another thing I noticed. Very sudden changes in dynamics, a kind of a chasm between certain dynamics. So those are some of the things that you can notice in there. There's also some things it's hard to put your finger on as to what makes this sound not quite realistic. But some of those things have to do with phrasing. That is, breathing. When are people breathing? I mean, obviously there's phrases in here which are logical, but the notation program, Play Engine, doesn't cut notes short the way a person would to take breaths at the regular opportunity. And there would be some phrasing in here and interpretation. A couple of other artifacts in there from the transfer over to Musescore 4. There's a glissando that didn't get taken out on this mark tree part. So you could hear that little artifact in there. Otherwise, does this tell you what you're writing and give you a pretty good audio sense as to what the finished product sounds like? Yes, that is the purpose of the Play Engine in a notation program. Now, we are going to push the envelope here and do a mock-up, a final product mock-up. And I'm not going to play for you the mastered post-process version of this. We're going to play right from the Play Engine, but it'll be a playback file of this exact same piece, and I'll go through all of the things that I changed about it after you get to hear it. So let's open up that file very quickly. Okay, so same piece, but obviously very different, very different. Let's do some comparison But before we do that, I want to play a sample of a real ensemble. This is one thing that you want to do when you're trying to create a mock-up in a digital audio workstation using MIDI sequencer and sampled libraries. Then you ought to do the same thing when you're using Musescore and the Play Engine if you want to get realism. Listen to a piece that is similar, has similar quality, similar instrumentation. And I've got one here. This is actually a piece from a suite by Philip Spark, composer, and this is for wind ensemble. And this is movement number 3 from a suite of dance pieces. And this is just for the brass section in the wind ensemble, which is very similar to what we would see here. Essentially one per part covering the gamut. And this is a section that is kind of heavier, right? And this is where I think people have the issue with the Musescore sounds, is on the heavy brass playing. They feel it doesn't quite hit the mark. Well, I want you to listen to a real piece. Hopefully I don't get a copyright ding just by playing a short segment here, and you're able to kind of gauge the similarity here. But this is lento for brass, kind of a heavier moment. Just listen carefully. Okay, so you can hear that kind of brassy edge sound when the instruments are playing full out. They're playing full out, and these are good collegiate ensemble performers. University of North Texas recorded that a long time ago. So these are, music majors really headed into their prime. Solid performance, and the that brassy, edgy sound, sometimes called cuivre, you'll see noted in certain kind of European notation, that edgy sort of sound. Really, it's just maximum volume, right? It's just maximum volume. It's full fortissimo kind of sound. And you compare that to what Musescore is doing here. So I'll come back to a section that is very similar to that. Start right here. This is full forte coming up to fortissimo later on. And there's that bug in Musescore. It wants to jump back to the beginning even though I picked a note. Try that again. Okay. Yeah, I think the Musescore people have it right. That's pretty dead on. I think to say that they don't have the brass sounds right in terms of the samples that they're using, I think that's not. I think people that are saying that, one, they don't understand the limitations of the Play Engine without changing the notation, which is what I'm talking about here, or two, they don't really have that great of a reference of brass playing. Right, they need to get out and hear more, listen to more real stuff that is exposed to understand what it is that you need to go for. So this is pretty close. Obviously, the one sound is a little darker. The North Texas recording, the real recording, a little darker, so you could EQ that. That's an issue for post-processing. All you need to do is take some of the brighter edge off of your EQ, and you're almost there. So, yeah, pretty good. Let's do some comparison between files, though. Let me open up the other version just so you can hear what it is that we have achieved. Okay, so we're looking at the other plain Jane version, and let's go over here to the same spot. So this is the exact same section with no alterations, none whatsoever. Now, just so you can see, kind of, let me see if I can line this up. So we have note 1 is right over here, and we'll go to the other instance of this. And we'll place note 1 in the same spot. So this is the playback file. And you see all the changes up here. Some of the note lengths, they don't end at the same time. A lot of notes have been shortened slightly for each instrument. Articulations have been added to create variance. So this is the playback. And then this one is the original. So you can see how everything is very cleanly notated here. Okay, so this is the original, starting at this spot right here. Listen. So I'll stop it right there. You hear how all of the stuff lines up perfectly, which is not realistic. That's not actually how it would come out. There'd be a little bit of variance between players, and it'd be a little bit more of a wash of sound. It wouldn't be bad playing. It would still be noticeably accurate, but it would not be identical, right? The way it's interpreting the glissando change from the quarter note to the next quarter note is not exactly how most players would interpret that. Over here, you see these marcato markings and accent, but it doesn't really separate, right? It's not ta, ta, ta. So you'll notice that when this plays it, and go to this note here, things are quite connected, right? There's not really any separation in there. Another one over here, same kind of spot, and you have this accent. Listen to how this is performed. Suddenly this accented note just really stands out. It's over the top, right? Even though there are accents going on down here and these are marcato, this one note on beat 2 is just extremely aggressive, right? Let's go now to the playback file, which has some variance. And you can see here the variance that I've provided. The note lengths are different, right? This is a dotted 16th, 8th. This has the marcato markings here, but the note lengths are a little bit different. The accents still sit there, but not on all the notes. I removed the accent on this note right here on the trombone because it was really popping out. I removed it here on the top horn part, again, because it was popping out, just kind of settle it down a little bit. And then over here on this other part, I changed the note values. I shortened up the note, added some staccato to give some separation. Note value change down here. We have a dotted 8th, 8th, regular 8th. 8th note back here to give some separation rather than, I think it was a quarter before on these. So a lot of variance and variation. In these triple tonguing sections up here, you can see the variance by dotting a few notes, adding a couple of extra articulations in there so that it just has a little bit more of a phasing effect player to player. Now, because it's so fast, it's still accurate. It still sounds like accurate playing, but it is not exactly identically the same. Same thing in the what would be bass trombone and tuba section down here. So let's listen to this again, back to back. Here is the first one, without any talking in between. Here is the first original score. You can also hear how this really goes out. Even though there's a hairpin dynamic, they're not settling down. That's partly because there's a forte piano on the other side of it, which is appropriate for notation. But this should be getting a lot softer here than just the forte. Let's go to the other one. Same spot. Okay, so you hear the difference by adding a whole lot more detail in there that wouldn't necessarily have to be written on the page. A lot of this interpretation would be quite intuitive to the real performance. The one big difference you can hear, I think, between the two, more than the variance of articulation and length, is you can hear people breathing on this playback file because of the spaces that have been added in there. You can hear people catching breaths, taking space, and not all at the same time. So there's a continuous sound throughout the ensemble, but it's not a continuous sound for every single player. There is human value there in terms of taking air, phrase endings, taking a breath, coming back in fully loaded. And that's what you're able to hear when these little breaks are added inside of the playback file. So this is how you get to realism in Musescore 4. You really will not get realism by waiting for updates from the play engine. It never is going to get there. It just is not. It's not within the realm of capability to read from scored notation that is scored for engraving purposes to be read by people. The notation has to have more detail to it in order to create a human equivalent, a human response. And that's why MIDI sequencers are powerful, because they take care of all of that. They are about the details. They are completely devoid of notation. Whenever you're creating a MIDI sequence, you're looking at the notation and you're making an interpretation in MIDI data. See, a forte is not an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. A forte is an 8 one time, it's a 7 another time, it's a 5 another time, it's a 10 in another scenario, right? It's all of these things, and it changes. There is a relativity to all of it that just can't be dealt with by notation alone. You have to have a human behind it, entering data, entering information, very detailed, and having variance in there. So anyway, that is just a little bit more of my preaching on the topic of creating realism using a notation playback engine like Musescore 4. Hopefully you've learned something for creating mock-ups, and I can make my point a little bit better known to those of you who've been questioning if you're out there. So anyway, good luck with this. Happy mixing.